if you look at the program, we let run kind of extended biographies of some of the people sitting up here. And the reason we did that in part is because of the very distinguished backgrounds. For example, Lou Hummel and Jeanne Barnett that I didn't know very much about. And I hope you'll read them and understand the really remarkable lives that these people have led. In our first, I had an email just a few days ago from Bill and Connie Root. And Connie Root's father, Walter Young, was our first China fellow, and I think he was appointed in 1928. And the Institute has a long and rich history of pioneering China studies. And of course, our former fellow, Badeau Barnett, is still considered, I think, the leading scholar and the pioneer of contemporary Chinese studies in the post-war period, and had an enormous influence on our policy toward China and relationship with China. And what I'm hoping to do today really is to capture just a little bit of the personal experience that we've had with that country. I feel a little bit, I'm putting people on the spot because none of them has actually prepared a presentation in the usual sense. And I'm going to start off by telling a couple of stories and then sort of asking some questions and trying to get a conversation going. And I have to say that many of you in the audience, too, have very rich and long experiences in that country. And I think, please, chime in. I began my professional, academic career really as a China specialist. And I remember I was in Taiwan in 1973, 1974, studying Chinese full-time at the Stanford Center. And that's where I had we have 4 hours of tutorials every morning from 8 to 12, and the rest of the day I was hitting the books. And all the faculty in that school were from Beijing, and whereas everyone else around there was from Taiwan. And so, you had it was a wonderful way to learn about Chinese accents, and because in Taiwan, out in the street, if someone was going to say something, no problem, they would say 没事. And then for standard Chinese, it's mei shi. And then, but for Beijing, it's mei shi. It's kind of this hard-sounding accent that I found was very useful in China, because if you go around China and speak with a Beijing accent, it commands attention. It sounds like you're official and powerful. And I can remember, well into my year of studying Chinese, there was a young Chinese woman who was teaching me from Beijing, and she got very serious about halfway through the lesson. We were reading some classical script or something, and so she asked me, she turned to me and said, 你觉得中国人很神秘吗? And literally that means, do you think Chinese are inscrutable? And I thought about it for a few minutes, and I said, no. And she laughed and laughed and laughed. She couldn't understand why foreigners are always saying Chinese are inscrutable. And I think that maybe the Japanese are inscrutable. I think that's possible. But the Chinese, what I found is if you learn their language, it's really like an open book, more than anything. And and so I think we're going to talk about that, how you open that book and how you see it a little bit. I was very impressed by Dan's metaphor of China like a movie, and I'm going to add to it. I think it's more like a multiplex. When I did my doctoral dissertation in Hong Kong, and we were studying, I was at that time studying rural development and the commune system as it was then constituted. And now, if you read the modern history of China, you find out that there are these successive waves of political campaigns that established various kinds of institutions and practices. And that's the way the Chinese Communist Party exercised its rule. And one of the things I discovered was that you go through a campaign, you set up an institution, and then you go through the next campaign and you set up something that is incompatible, or you close down that old institution. But it didn't happen everywhere. And so in some ways, I felt like the Chinese government in different places in the country was like a museum of past political policies and political campaigns, because you have this image of China marching in lockstep. But in fact, they were way out of sync. And you know, a lot of things that were supposed to be happening were not in different places. When the first time I spent a year in Taiwan, a year in Hong Kong, and the first time I actually arrived in China was January 2nd, 1980, on a grant. This was in the first wave of academic and cultural exchanges with China. And this was on a grant from the National Science Foundation. I arrived on the 2nd, and it was, you know, Beijing is not a very pleasant place to be on January 2nd. And I didn't realize, I was thinking I was going to avoid the New Year's holiday. And of course, January 2nd is a holiday in China. And this Academy of Social Sciences sent my handler out to meet me at the airport, who was only, he was not very happy to have to give up his holiday. And so I was suggesting, you know, my first time in China, tomorrow, well, let's go out to the Summer Palace. And the winds were blowing, and he said, well, you know, if we go to the Summer Palace tomorrow, we're going to be the only people there. And so I began to learn about the kind of, I guess, the rigidity and the expectations, and, you know, within that system. They actually sent someone. It turns out I was sent to a village. I was doing research in a commune at that time with 16 different villages, and that commune agreed to take me only on the condition that somebody accompanied me from Beijing. And if you made it to Beijing, you know, you don't want to be out in a village. And you know, over time, the people loosened up, and I was able to move around quite a lot. But any time that I ran into trouble, I wanted something that the local people really weren't comfortable or didn't want to provide. This guy from Beijing would be trotted out, and with a very sort of sweet and smile on his face, you know, he talked to them about, you know, the revolution and Mao, and then everyone would become very silent. And this, I learned, you know, was the voice of power. When I went, the next time I went back was actually during my fellowship. I accompanied a crew from National Public Radio. We went all around the country, and I won't tell you too much about that, but this is 1983, I was in Shanghai, and I went for the first time. I took the ferry across the river to Pudong, and Pudong was a slum. And there was a public park not too far from the ferry, and there was a big cage, well, not too big, but there was a woman inside in kind of a circus outfit in leotards, with her sort of ankles, you know, curled over. And inside the cage were a lot of snakes crawling around. And that was, you know, it was kind of it was a big crowd and popular entertainment. And the next time I went to Pudong was in advance of President Clinton's visit in 1998. And of course, the park wasn't there anymore. And it was a field of skyscrapers. Beyond that, there were parks and housing developments, and General Motors was just cutting the ribbon on their Buick assembly plant, not far from there. And through that period, that was the last time I was in China, but through that period from 1980 to 1998, I went back almost every year